We've all heard the phrase, the grass is greener on the other side. And it's interesting to see how true that is in so many areas of life. If you're driving through a farm community, you see the farm animals that are sticking their heads through the fences to eat the grass on the other side, even though they are in a field with plenty of grass to eat. They see the grass as greener, I guess, on the other side. Even in kids that are playing with toys. We give a child a toy, but they want the toy that someone else has, even if it's the exact same thing, because they think that toy is better than the one that they're playing with. And even as we get older, we find the jobs that we enjoy or the careers that we're in, but we find a good job, a good career, but then we're always looking for something better. We're looking for that next step. We're looking for the grass that is greener on the other side. And unfortunately, it happens so much of the time in our relationships. How many marriages have been destroyed because we're always looking for something better? Someone else comes into our life that is meeting a need that our spouse is not meeting. And the marriage is destroyed because we think, oh, that's a better relationship there than the one I currently have. Instead of working on the one that I have, I'm going to go to where it's easier because the grass is always greener on the other side. And that's kind of what happened with the people of Israel. They had a good thing. They had a good thing going with God. But they kept looking to the grass on the other side. They kept looking to things that would maybe please them, they think would please them more. And last week we began looking at the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet sent by God to give a message to the people of Israel, a message to the people that had turned away from their allegiance to God. And today we're looking at Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 19. And he begins this part of, the initial part of his prophecy. Jeremiah tells the people that he reminds them of their devotion to God that they had early on. The people of Israel, they were taken captive into Egypt, and they were there for many years. And God leads them out of Egypt. With Moses leading the way, he leads them out of Egypt into the wilderness, through the wilderness, into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he reminds them of that devotion that they had with God and how they followed him wherever he went. In the wilderness, those 40 years, God led them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He was with them, literally with them, to where they could see with their eyes the presence of God in those images. And he provided food for them, manna from heaven, and he provided drink for them, water from a rock. And they followed him wherever he led them until they reached the promised land. And as they went into the promised land, then they were also they were going to come under attack, and they were to attack cities and peoples because the Israelites, they were moving into the land that belonged to them. It was God's land set apart for the Israelites. And so the Israelites went in and they attacked these cities and these areas and came under attack as well, but God protected them through it all because he was devoted to them as they were devoted to him. And no matter the size of the armies that they came against, God was on their side. And so that devotion for God was strong at the beginning. But during that relationship, even in times in the wilderness and then again in the land, there came a times where they became distracted from God and his leading. Early on when they were in the wilderness, in the desert, there were a couple times where they didn't have water. And the people began complaining and saying, oh, it would be better for us to go back into captivity, to go back to Egypt, and instead of dying out here with whoever this Moses guy is and leading us into the desert to die because we don't have enough water. And they complained about that, but then God gives them water through a rock. And during that journey, they were given that manna to eat, bread from heaven. And every day, God provided what they needed for that day. Every day. And they got tired of eating manna. I mean, we can all understand that. 40 years of every meal being Frosted Flakes, we'd get tired of that after a while. But they complained about that, and God ends up giving them quail to eat. But they're distracted because even though God is providing for them, they want more. They want more. And even with God's evident presence there, with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, they look to men and idols for their protection. Even though God brought them through the wilderness and into a fertile land, they began to follow worthless idols. And instead of calling out to the Lord, they rebelled against him and defiled the land. They were distracted from God's choice for them, what God had for them. And because of that destruction, they ended up turning from the path chosen by God and went their own way, which ended up bringing destruction upon them. Those that walked through the wilderness, there were a group there that did not believe or struggled with what was going on, and God said, okay, those of you who are in that place where you are distracted from me or not with me, you're not going to enter the promised land. You're going to end up dying in the wilderness. And only those that follow me will be able to enter into the promised land. And that destruction that came upon them, they were not listening to the leading of God anymore. And in fact, they wanted to be like all the other nations around them. When they entered into the promised land and they overtook these lands, they looked at the places around them and they saw that all these other people groups had kings, and they didn't. They were led by God himself, but they wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted a king, and so God gave them a king. And ever since then, they've had good kings and bad kings, but destruction has come upon those people because eventually they were taken into captivity again. And by forsaking the Lord and taking their own path, they brought upon themselves the destruction when their enemies came in. And what Jeremiah shares is that they laid waste his land and his towns are burned and deserted. They were destroyed because they were no longer devoted to God, but they were distracted from him. The grass is always greener. And so destruction came upon them. But he ends the beginning of this prophecy. He basically tells them it would do them well to take heed of God's directions for them. He says, why go to Egypt to drink water from the Nile? And why go to Assyria to drink water from the Euphrates? And he ends it with, consider then and realize how evil and bitter it is for you when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of me. The direction of turn back to me. Remember the things that I have done. Remember how I led you out of Egypt through the wilderness into the promised land and fought for you. Remember me and regain that awe of my presence. Remember how I led you by the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. How I fed you with manna from heaven and gave you drink from a rock. How I protected you. And have that awe of me. Because as we follow that direction of returning to him, we become devoted to him again and focused upon him. And this prophecy from Jeremiah to the Israelites, I think it fits well with our relationship, the relationship that we have with God through Jesus Christ. If we look back at what Jeremiah said, we need to remain devoted to God. Early on, they were devoted to him. They followed him wherever he went, out of Egypt, into the wilderness, into the promised land. They followed. They were devoted. Like a new bride, the love that they had for God. Well, through Jesus Christ, we are the bride of Christ. The people of God are being joined together to form the bride of Christ, and the bride loves the groom, and the groom is Jesus himself. And to have that devotion to him and that love for him that surpasses everything else, that we are completely devoted to him and nobody else and nothing else. He is the center of everything that we do and think and say. Our allegiance is placed upon him, and that's really tough. In our nation, what do we focus on? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, which is good, but our allegiance isn't to be there. Our allegiance is upon God through Jesus Christ. He is where our focus needs to be. Things may go crazy in our nation, in our world, but he is firm. He is our foundation. He is the core of our life. He is the center of everything, and we are to be devoted to him. Because if we are devoted to other things, our devotion isn't upon God. It's not upon Christ. It's upon the other things in our lives. And so to pour our love in and our love into him and our allegiance upon him, knowing that he's going to protect us. And again, this season that we're in our country where there's so much unrest, to know that we are protected by God. No matter what happens to us, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. It doesn't matter what happens to us. If we live or die, we are protected by God. If we die, we're with him. If we live, we get to serve him. We are completely devoted to this person of Jesus Christ. We are in love with him, our allegiance is upon him, and our protection comes from him no matter what happens to us. But so much of the time, there's so many times in our devotion to God through Christ, distractions come. And we need to be aware of the distractions that arise around us. The Israelites, they had forgotten what God had done for them. They had forgotten how he led them out of Egypt and provided for them through the wilderness and brought them into the promised land and fought for them and gave the land to them. And they forgot all about that. And how easy it is for us to forget the things that God has done. How has he led us? How has he spoken to us? How has he provided for us? How has he protected us? And we're quick to forget the good things. And we're distracted from that devotion because we turn to other things. We end up turning to worthless idols. And idols can be anything that takes the place of God being first place. Whether it's our spouse, the relationships we're in, our children, our job, our careers, the cars we drive, the house we own, all those things, even the church we go to, can end up being an idol because we are devoted to the things rather than to God himself. And we're distracted. It might be good things that we're distracted by, but that distraction takes us away from the devotion to God and into worthless things. And so when we turn to those worthless idols and we forget about what God has done, punishment can come. God can remove the blessing that he's given us. And we end up coming under punishment. Just like the Israelites, they came under destruction because they chose to turn away from God. They chose to defile the land. And we need to avoid destruction that comes from our own desires. He says, why are you forsaking there are two sins. That's what he says. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Forsaking the Lord, the spring of living water. What is the living water? That's Jesus. Jesus is the living water. And he's saying you forsake the Lord. You forsake Jesus, the living water, and you turn to other gods. And because of that turning, destruction comes upon you. You pursue your own ways. You're digging your own cisterns. You're filling the void with things other than Jesus. And there are so many things in our world that we can fill that void with. You know, we always talk sex and drugs and alcohol and money but it's so much more. It can be sports, music, food, whatever it is. And we fill that void with things other than Jesus. And we pursue activity over a relationship. You know, even in the church, we have so many activities going on through the week. You need to be at these activities. You need to be doing this. And even if Jesus isn't there, we fill that void with the activity of church, with the activity of service, rather than the relationship with God or the relationship with Christ. And destruction can come upon us because we're distracted from what true devotion really is. But God gives them some directions to keep them devoted to him. You know, at the end of this prophecy, he says, why go to Egypt? Why go to Egypt to drink from the Nile, the water from the Nile? And why go to Assyria to drink from the water of the Euphrates? Instead, what does he say? Consider then and realize how evil and bitter it is when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of him. You know, he says, why go to Egypt? Why go back there and drink from that water? Remember, Jesus is the living water. He's actually the bread from heaven. He is the manna from heaven that we're to eat of. He is the water from the rock. He is the rock, and he is the living water that gives life to us. And God says, why go back to Egypt to drink from the Nile? Because Egypt really represents worldly pleasures and material success. You know, why go, and that's one of those things, those distractions. We pursue the things that will bring worldly pleasure, material success. You know, we want to do things to provide more for our families. And I say that all the time. I wish I could do something more to provide more for my family, to help with homes and vehicles and school, and the list goes on. Or you get to that place where, boy, we need a larger home. And so it's all about the home. It's all about the position that we're in, the financial position that we're in. And he says, why go to Egypt? Why go back to those worldly pleasures? Why go back to the material success? That's not going to get us anywhere, because that will be devoted to those things rather than devoted to him. And he says, why go back to Assyria? And I think Assyria, Babylon, they're the same region. And eventually the Israelites, they end up going back into captivity, or into captivity into Babylon. And it's from Babylon that only a remnant come back to Jerusalem because they're comfortable in Babylon. Well, Babylon represents the growth and success of organized religion, or just life in general. It was in Babylon or Assyria where they built the synagogues. They put roots down. And when the opportunity came to go back to Jerusalem, to go back with Nehemiah and rebuild the wall and rebuild the city, that most of them chose to stay in Babylon or in Assyria, because that's where their roots were. That's where the devotion was. They were devoted to the success of their life, the success of being rooted where they were, the success of the synagogue, rather than coming back to who God is. Because where God wants us to be is in Canaan, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that represents Jesus Christ. He wants us to partake of him. He is the one that we are to feed off of. Like I said, he is the bread of life. He is the living water. He is the land in which we get our sustenance. And God gives that direction that we are to pursue a life with Christ and fall in love with him, and to gain that awe of him that comes only from him. So the beginning of this prophecy from Jeremiah, I think as believers in Jesus Christ, we just need to remember that we are the bride of Christ. We are to love him, be devoted to him. That we are part of the fertile land, the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, which represents Jesus Christ, from whom we receive all sustenance that we need. We need to remember that he is the living water that we are to drink from. He is the one that will give us life. Nothing else in this world will give us life, only him. And remember to follow the leading of the Lord, whether it's through his word, through the fellowship we have with other believers, through the Spirit of God that is speaking to us here and now. To follow him, follow that leading, follow the direction, to be fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.